to center down. What beautiful words. I've used this meditation from Howard Thurman many services in the past. Mary Beth, very nice job reading it. So, and thank you for helping out with today's service. Howard Thurman is very special to me. I have been reading his work for a number of years, and I think it's, in my opinion, and I'm not the only one who shares this view, I think Howard Thurman was one of the greatest ministers, preachers, spiritual guides, and teachers of not just the 20th century, but in my view, any century. His was a voice and a vision that comforted, stirred, inspired, and provided spiritual guidance for generations of seekers and activists, and especially for those who, as Thurman very often said, live with their backs against the wall. Here's a picture of Dr. Thurman, the mature Howard Thurman wearing his ministerial regalia. I first encountered Howard Thurman really intensively in a wonderful class that I took when I was a student in seminary. The class offered an introduction to his life and to his incredible body of work, including some of his most important and meaningful sermons, meditations, and books. He quickly became an essential part of my spiritual journey and my ministry, and I have returned to his words like the words that Mary Beth just read over and over again. Meditations like the work of Christmas, which I invariably end any Christmas Eve service that I lead. How good to center down, and another meditation that you'll hear in a few weeks on Easter Sunday called The Glad Surprise. These are just, they are an essential and regular part of my ministerial repertoire, I guess. And then there's his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, which he wrote way back in the 1940s. And it is, and I'll say more about it in a minute, it's the best book that I've ever read about Jesus of Nazareth, and it provided the intellectual and spiritual inspiration for what several decades later came to be known as Black liberation theology. Now, before I tell you a little bit about why Howard Thurman has become so important to my spiritual life, let me just do a little advertising here. Beginning on April the 3rd, I'm going to be offering a class about Thurman, and I hope if you haven't signed up that you will consider signing up. Here's a screenshot of the place on the website where you can sign up for the class. It'll only be 5 weeks. It'll be on Zoom. Yeah, there it is. We'll reflect on Thurman's life and work and connect his ideas to our own spiritual journeys and to the wider world. So if you're interested, please do visit the website, and where you can just fill out that registration form, and we'll begin our study of Thurman in early April. So as I said, Howard Thurman is so very, very important to my spiritual life and journey. Every time I read or listen to a meditation like the one Mary Beth shared, I find myself centering down, listening for that deeper note at the core of my being. I have to say there's something so meaningful and powerful about Howard Thurman's words that cut right through the clashings and noise that are always in my mind, and that leads me to think and feel and experience life at a deeper level. And during the class, we will have the opportunity to listen to Thurman's words in Thurman's own voice. And I think you're going to enjoy listening to that voice. It's the reason that Thurman was named during his lifetime, I think either by Life magazine or Time magazine, as one of America's finest preachers. And he was an outstanding preacher. But even if you can't take the class, I can't recommend you dipping into his books and meditations highly enough. For example, I love his autobiography, which is called the same title as today's sermon, With Head and Heart. It's one of the finest spiritual autobiographies I've ever read. It's a powerful and inspiring memoir of his life and is written through what I can best describe as a deeply spiritual, even mystical lens. The stories that he shares from his childhood and his years at Morehouse College and Rochester Theological Seminary to his time as a minister, writer, and teacher, they're a testament. They're a testament to the importance of living life with intention, with purpose, and with a deep awareness of not only the world around us, but the world within us, which Thurman often called, and I love this phrase, our inward sea. Our inward sea. I can't possibly do justice in a sermon to all the ideas and experiences that make Howard Thurman so extraordinary. But let me just say a word, let me just tell you a few things, and let me begin with his childhood, because it's so formative for everything that Thurman became later in life. Howard Thurman was born in segregated Daytona Beach, Florida in the very early 20th century, the early 1900s. His father died at a young age, and when Thurman was just a very young child, and he was raised by his mother and his grandmother. Because Dad had passed away, his mother was forced to work many, many long hours outside the home. So it was Thurman's grandmother, Grandma Nancy, who was the most important influence in his childhood. I think I have a picture of Grandma Nancy. There she is. That's the only picture of her that we have. Growing up under segregation, young Howard was bombarded every day with reminders that he was a second-class citizen. Couldn't drink at the same water fountains, go to the same schools as white children. He was reminded every day that he wasn't equal, that he was undeserving, that he was less than whole. Well, I can tell you that Grandma Nancy would have none of it. She herself had grown up an enslaved person. And on a regular basis, she would tell her grandchildren the story of a minister, an enslaved minister from her childhood, who would preach as often as he could that Jesus himself was one of them, that he had been an oppressed person, hardly better than a slave himself, that all who were held in slavery were not the degraded, vile beings the slave masters called them and made them feel like, and that each and every one of them was a child of God. Thurman recounts in his autobiography how his whole being would quiver and pulse with raw energy when Grandma Nancy told this story, and how he would be able to return to the world of segregation and oppression, knowing that although his back was against the wall, he was a person of dignity and worth, a person loved and cherished by God and understood and loved by Jesus. And it is this faith that he learned from his grandmother, the faith that all people are children of God and that all people have within them an inward sea of freedom and dignity. It was this faith that forms the heart of Howard Thurman's theological and spiritual vision. And as Grandma Nancy taught young Howard over and over again, every person means every person, including and especially those who are treated as less than and who live with their backs against a wall. Now, I keep using this phrase, backs against the wall, because Howard Thurman returned to it time and time again. Of course, his teaching and preaching and writing are directed to all of the human family, but he was especially concerned to help and to speak to those who are marginalized and oppressed, and to help them find the strength and courage for the journey. Strength and courage that flowed from their inward sea, from their inherent worth and dignity. And that brings me now to that little book that I mentioned earlier, what I think is Thurman's greatest and most influential work, Jesus and the Disinherited. Even if we're going to read this book in the class, but even if you're not taking the class, get a copy of it. This is thick. It's like 100 pages. It is really, really thin. But in that book, Thurman paints a portrait of Jesus that, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, is more historically grounded, theologically rich, and spiritually meaningful than anything else that's ever been written about Jesus of Nazareth. And what Thurman argues, building on what he heard from Grandma Nancy, what he argues in that book is that in order to understand Jesus, who he was, how he lived, and what he taught, it is essential to begin by remembering that he himself was an oppressed person, and that his teaching and ministry were directed first and foremost to a community of people whose backs were against a wall. As Thurman points out, more often than not, Jesus, that's not the Jesus that we hear about. And I talked some about this last week, and I might go off again, so warning ahead. So the Jesus that is so often preached, that one hears so often, especially among Christians who are privileged, that Jesus, I think, has often been domesticated. The message has been watered down. And a view of Jesus is propagated that, as Thurman, I think, said so well, that treats Jesus as a religious object to be worshiped and believed in, rather, and this is, I love this way Thurman puts this, rather than as a religious subject whose life and ministry offer a vision, a challenge, and an invitation to how human beings can, ought, and are supposed to live. And what Jesus' life teaches us is that a God of love is at the heart of existence, and that a powerful, all-embracing love offers itself to everyone, and especially, again, to those who live their lives with their backs against the wall. Jesus himself was an oppressed person. He was part of a community of people who were living under the thumb of an empire and under the thumb of a corrupt collaborationist king, King Herod. Jesus lived with his back against the wall, and his ministry was about, how do you find hope? How do you carry on? How do you live with courage and authenticity in circumstances like that? That's what Jesus was about. And that's the Jesus that Howard Thurman talks about so beautifully in that book. You know, there's so much more I could say about Jesus and the Disinherited. I could preach 20 sermons about it, but let me wrap up this discussion by saying that Thurman's argument about Jesus has touched the lives of so many people living on the margins and has offered strength and reassurance to those who are struggling for justice. I mentioned earlier that it is considered the foundational text of what came to be known as liberation theology, and you may not be aware that rumors are that this is the one book that Martin Luther King Jr. carried in his briefcase everywhere he went. Let me now say a word about Howard Thurman and Dr. King. When King was a doctoral student at Boston University, Howard Thurman was on the faculty. He was a professor and also the dean of the chapel at BU, meaning he was kind of like the minister of the university. Now, it isn't clear that Dr. King ever took a class from Thurman, but there can be no doubt that Thurman's ideas had a profound influence on him. Howard Thurman was not really a social activist. He didn't organize protests or marches, but he is often cited and credited with providing the spiritual, and one might even say the mystical foundation for the civil rights movement. Through his preaching and writing, Thurman connected activists with their inward seas and with the spiritual resources they needed to engage in the struggle. In fact, before important social protests, before important nonviolent campaigns, the movement would often ask, even require activists to engage in a process of what was called self-purification, to prepare themselves for confronting unjust power. That process included practices like prayer and silence, meditation, self-reflection. And I believe that this emphasis on spiritual preparation and purification was a result of Howard Thurman's influence. And it is a helpful reminder of the essential connection that Thurman reminds us of so beautifully, the essential connection between spiritual practice, connecting with our inward sea, and the work of social justice. And now, speaking of the work of social justice and activism, let me take a moment now to invite and encourage you to be part of the upcoming Nehemiah Action, which is being held by the organization Impact, of which this congregation is a founding and very active member. This action will take place on Tuesday, March the 21st from 6:30 to 8 at the MLK Center for the Performing Arts. Impact is working on vitally important issues and has developed a wonderful and very actionable agenda in the areas of transportation, childcare, and affordable housing. And as the civil rights movement and so many other movements for justice have taught us, power must be confronted and held accountable. And that is precisely what Impact and the Nehemiah Action seek to achieve. So I hope to see many of you there on the 21st, and be sure to talk to Kelsey and Haley. There's Kelsey and Haley, wave. There they are. They'll be in the social hall. They'll be at a table that you can RSVP. They'll give you information. They have tickets. So make sure you say hello to them and make sure you talk to them about this really, really important action. I understand that in past years before COVID, we've turned out 100, 150 people at the Nehemiah Action. So it would be wonderful if we could approach or duplicate or exceed those numbers again. Howard Thurman's understanding of Jesus and his views about the connection between spirituality and social activism are only two things of the many ideas that we're going to talk about and experience from his life in the class. We'll spend talking about Thurman's reverence for nature. There's a beautiful story he writes about, and we'll talk about it, where in his childhood there was this huge oak tree. There's actually a picture of it, but I didn't put that on the screen today. When he was a boy and he would come home and feel kind of sad about, all the difficulties of life, he would go out, sit up against that tree, look up at the stars, and talk to it. So Howard Thurman talked to trees as a child. And that tree listened. It was his friend. So we'll talk about talking to trees. We'll talk about Thurman's life-changing visit to India in the 1930s, where he got to meet and dialogue with Mahatma Gandhi. We'll talk about his amazing ministry at the first intentionally founded interracial congregation in the United States, the Church for the Fellowship of All Peoples in San Francisco. He was the first minister of that congregation. So there's so much So much rich material here. I hope you all will either take the class or at least engage with Howard Thurman. Engaging with him is a life-changing experience. So let me just conclude this morning by encouraging all of you to take time to cultivate and to listen to your inward center. If life is pushing you up against a wall or somehow telling you that you are less than the precious person you are, listen to the voices of Grandma Nancy and Howard Thurman. You are a person of dignity and worth, and there is nothing in this world that will ever change that. And if you are a person of privilege, as I am, someone who has been gifted with many blessings and advantages, find ways to tear down those walls and to build the beloved community. As Howard Thurman so clearly understood, that is what Jesus of Nazareth was calling us to do. That's what Dr. King was calling us to do. And that is most certainly what Howard Thurman and Grandma Nancy are calling us to do. Thank you so much for listening this morning. Thank you for letting me tell you about Howard Thurman. Amen, and blessed be. So I now invite you to rise in body or spirit. We're going to enjoy a video and the words will be on the screen. This is hymn number 108, if you want to follow along in the gray hymnal. My life flows on in endless song. So please rise.